On the 23rd of September 63 BC, just before sunrise, a child that would inevitably form the greatest empire known to man would be born. His name? Gaius Octavius. The paternal side of his family features many respectable men who held a significant role in the Roman Republic. His father Gaius Octavius was a Roman politician who rose to the role of proconsul of Macedonia. He had been commissioned by the Senate to fight off runaway slaves in Furi, and is believed to be where Octavian derives his cognomen Furinus from. Octavian's grandfather, also called Gaius Octavius, was a municipal magistrate who enjoyed a comfortable long life. Lastly, his great-grandfather, who had a totally original name from the bunch, called Gaius Octavius, fought in Sicily during the Second Punic War under Aemilius Pappus. The two would unfortunately spend little time with each other, as his father would die while returning to Rome, leaving the 4-year-old Octavian fatherless. The maternal side of Octavian's family is the crucial bloodline, since it involves one of the most distinguished figures in Rome's history. Aetia Balba Caesonia was the niece of Gaius Julius Caesar, and yes, that's how you say it. Octavian's grandmother, Julia Minor, was the older sister of Caesar. She showed much affection and took a lot of care for the young Octavian. He deeply loved his grandmother, and when she passed away in 51 BC, the 12-year-old Octavian would deliver a funeral oration in her honor. At 16, Octavian would come of age and serve Julius Caesar in the Spanish expedition of 46 BC. The voyage did not go as planned, as Octavian would be shipwrecked on the coast. He and his crew would have to navigate through the hostile terrain to reach Caesar's camp. The determination of his nephew greatly delighted Caesar, who designated him senior military command in his Parthian expedition in 44 BC, and would be appointed to Apollonia to prepare and study. However, the expedition never materialized, as Caesar would be relentlessly stabbed 23 times by the Senate on the 15th of March 44 BC. The message of the assassination reached Octavian, who hurried back to Rome. Caesar's will was read out, which contained the adoption of Octavian. He would assume his adopted father's name, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Octavian's hatred towards the assassins was deep. As such, he wanted to deliver swift justice. Decimus Brutus played a significant role in the assassination of Caesar. He was heavily influenced by the main instigator of the plot, Gaius Cassius Longinus. Post-assassination, the two men were reassigned provinces, with Brutus receiving Cisalpine Gaul and Cassius the province of Syria. The decision of letting Brutus being assigned to Gaul infuriated Mark Antony, who was a relative and supporter of the late Caesar. Since Antony's 1-year term as consul was ending, he wished to be appointed to govern the province, but instead got Macedonia. He gathered his legions and marched to take it by force. The actions of Antony enacted the Senate to denounce him as an outlaw of Rome. Cicero's speeches, known as the Philippici, greatly influenced the Romans to detest Antony, and instead cheered on for the young Octavian. He was awarded praetorian rank, and was given command of an army with the help of the two consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, for the relief of Brutus. Not long after, 2 of Antony's legions defected him, and Octavian was given legal rights to command the troops. The campaign was short-lasting, a mere 3 months of fighting. However, during the Battle of Mutina, the 2 consuls of the year would be killed. Hirtius would fall in battle while Pansa succumbed to a wound. The former's body would be personally rescued by Octavian. Antony himself would flee over the Alps. The Senate asserted Brutus as commander of the legions, and Pompey's son Sextus over Rome's fleet, as they wanted to get rid of Octavian. In return, he marched on Rome and extorted the Senate to be made consul with his cousin Quintus Pedius as proconsul. He would condemn the assassins of Caesar in absentia and repealed the declaration that Mark Antony was an outlaw. He deserted the Optimatus senators in order to secretly negotiate terms of alliance with Antony and Aemilius Lepidus, who was protecting Antony. The three men would meet in Bologna, and the second triumvirate was constituted on the 27th of November, 43 BC. They split up the provinces. Octavian controlled Africa, Lepidus got Spain and Antony Gaul, while Sextus controlled the Mediterranean islands with his fleet. Brutus and Cassius held the eastern Mediterranean provinces. Cicero would be executed along with a third of the senators who were involved in Caesar's death, just 2 weeks after he was proscribed as an enemy of the state by the triumvirate. His head would be cut off and his right hand was pinned up on the rostra in the forum. The lands would be confiscated and fortunes were used to replenish the treasury. The next move of the alliance was to punish the two assassins of Caesar. The men would gather and fight two battles at Philippi in northern Greece. The first battle took place on 3rd of October, where Antony and Octavian would launch a frontal assault.
Octavian would be unsuccessful against Brutus, and his troops would have to fall back. On the other hand, Antony broke through Cassius's defense, but had to retreat and aid Octavian.
Although a draw, Cassius would end his life thinking his army had lost. Octavian proved himself in the second encounter. Brutus would launch a counter-attack on the causeway, which was in a marsh, disabling his cavalry. He would be surrounded and knowing his demise also ended his life. The head of Brutus was brought back to Rome and thrown at the feet of Caesar's statue, finally avenging his late father. With the two assassins dead and more provinces for themselves, Antony kept the Gallic provinces, but adding all the eastern to govern. Meanwhile, Octavian and Lepidus traded provinces, with the former now ruling Hispania and the latter Africa. The last threat of the triumvirate, Sextus Pompey, still lurked in Sicily with his fleet blocking off grain supply. Before he could be dealt with, Octavian had to deal with a conspiracy. A plot was formed to revolt against Octavian by Mark Antony's younger brother Lucius Antony. He formed an alliance with the most powerful woman in Rome, Fulvia, who was Mark Antony's wife. Fulvia got furious after Octavian sent her daughter, Claudia, back to her mother after just 2 years of marriage, insisting that the marriage had not been consummated. In which would be known as the Parisine War, the two would raise 8 legions, but would retreat to Perugia, where Octavian would besiege the city and starve them out to surrender. Lucius would be appointed to Spain while Fulvia was exiled to Greece, and shortly died due to illness. The tension with Mark Antony and Octavian grew rapidly, but it was loosened when Octavian's sister Octavia would marry Antony within few weeks of Fulvia's death. However, Antony never loved Octavia, as he himself adored Cleopatra, who was the queen of Egypt. In the previous year, Antony met with Cleopatra in Tarsus to smoothen the alliance between Rome and Egypt. Antony succeeded in strengthening relations but also was enchanted by Cleopatra's beauty and began an affair. In the year of the revolt, he would have twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Octavian needed a fleet force to fight Sextus. He agreed with Antony to send 20,000 legionaries to Antony's campaign against Parthia in exchange for 120 ships. Antony gave the 120 as he promised, while Octavian only delivered half of the troops. The Sicilian War would last for a while, until in 36 BC, Octavian would finally defeat Sextus between Mylae and Naulochus. Much of the accomplishment can be attributed to his faithful friend and the commander of the fleet, Marcus Agrippa. In a not so impressive move, Lepidus decided to seize command of the legions and claim Sicily for himself, but was unsuccessful in his efforts and as such was kicked out of the triumvirate. He was exiled to Circe, where he would spend his days as Pontifex Maximus. In the same year, Antony would have another child with Cleopatra, called Ptolemy Philadelphus. 32 BC was the year the ball got rolling. Antony would divorce Octavia, which infuriated Octavian to the point where he would storm the Vestal Virgin's temple and take Antony's will reading it out to the Senate. The will contained Antony's plan to give Rome's provinces to his sons and desired for his body to be buried in Egypt after his death. This infuriated the Romans, and was hardly the will of a true Roman, to the point where Antony was stripped of his powers, and the Senate declared war on him and Cleopatra. A third of the senators would defect to Antony's side. In the following year, the two would fight near Actium in northern Greece, but Antony and Cleopatra would lose at sea. Then, the fateful Battle of Actium would take place on 2nd September, which would decide the fate of Rome. Octavian swiftly and decisively got the edge of his faithful friend Agrippa, who managed to carve the opponent's supply line. The two lovers would flee to Egypt. Antony would fall on his sword thinking that Cleopatra was dead, but he stayed alive long enough to witness her unharmed. He would die in her arms. Cleopatra would let a venomous snake bite her the next week, killing her. Octavian honored the two lovers by allowing them to have a burial in the same tomb. However, he would not spare the young Caesarion, who was promptly executed. Now at this point of time, Augustus would visit the tomb of Alexander, and where he would say the baddest words, "I came to see a king, not a row of corpses." The war was won, and Egypt was swiftly turned into a Roman province, with a new city being founded to honor his victory at Actium, called Nicopolis. In the summer of 29 BC, Octavian would hold three triumphs. First, to celebrate his conquest at Dalmatia. The following day was his victory at Actium, and at the third day, his subjugation of Egypt. In the last triumph, the treasury of Egypt was paraded as well as the twins of Cleopatra wrapped in golden chains. Fortunately, they were given to Octavian's sister, Thrace. Octavian was the sole ruler of Rome, and on the 16th of January, 27 BC, the Senate reached a compromise, known as the First Settlement, which gave Octavian proconsular authority over the western half of the empire in Syria. More importantly, he was awarded two titles: Augustus, meaning great or venerable, and Princeps, or first citizen, and would retain his title of Imperator as the position of supreme military commander. His name from then on would be known as Imperator Kaiser Divi Filius Augustus. 4 years after ascension, Augustus would fall gravely ill. He was bedridden, and feared the worst. He would pass his signet ring and government documents to his close friends, Marcus Agrippa and Maecenas, respectively. Once he recovered, the second settlement between Augustus and the Senate was compromised, which gave him power of tribune and censor, allowing him to call meetings, veto Senate's actions, speak first at Senate meetings, supervise public morality, and hold a census. Augustus's main focus was to replenish Rome's infrastructure and reform much of its laws and practices. Since the Civil War, many structures were neglected due to a lack of funding. Many new structures emerged such as the Theatre of Marcellus, the Horologium, the Temple of Apollo, and the Forum of Augustus, with its Temple of Mars Ultor. His trusted friend Agrippa accompanied in aid by lending a hand in projects like the Pantheon in the Campus Martius. He was also responsible for mending the city's water supply and building two aqueducts, the Aqua Julia and Aqua Virgo. Augustus would reorganize the economic system and establish the Roman postal service, the police, and the fire department, as well as the notorious Praetorian Guard. He integrated a census and taxation system as well as a road system for the entire empire. He reformed the Roman calendar, as it had fallen under much confusion. A day would be removed from February and would be transferred to Sextilius, which would be renamed in Augustus's honor as August. Many rites and appointments were revived, such as the Augury of Safety, the Office of the Flamen of Jupiter, the Lupercalia, the Secular Games, and the Compitalia. Augustus was horrified by the adulterous behavior within the city, and he much condemned it. He enacted many laws which dealt with adultery and unchastity, but he also rewarded those virtuous Romans who had large families. He sought out to fight more antisocial behavior, especially of the bandits, who would rob passerbys on the Roman roads with swords supposedly used for self-defense. He reacted by stationing armed police in bandit-ridden districts and dissolved many workmen guilds, which were carrying illegitimate business. More office positions were created, especially to upkeep the public building roads and aqueducts dealing with clearing of the Tiber Channel and the distribution of grain to the people. The prefect of the city would also be established, which would act as a quasi-mayor. He would standardize army pay and allowances according to military ranks to suppress potential revolts and mutinies. Once he finished reorganizing Rome, he sought to increase the population of Italy by founding 28 veteran colonies. They were given supplies of municipal building and revenue, granting them some privileges and honors seen in Rome. One of Augustus's goals was as a ruler to ensure a successor to the throne. He never had any male biological children, and as such opted to make one of his family members the potential heir. His initial successor would be Marcellus, who was married to his only biological daughter Julia through his second marriage with Scribonia. However, the young Marcellus would fall ill and die the same year the emperor had recovered. This event left Agrippa as the obvious candidate. Agrippa was made to divorce his current wife and marry the now widowed Julia. The two together would have 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. His potential successor and close friend would unfortunately die in 12 BC, leaving Julia widowed once again. As Agrippa's sons were too young to be fit to the throne, he had to look at the sons of Livia. In 11 BC, Tiberius was forced to divorce his wife Vespasia, who he deeply was attached to, and had to marry Julia. Tiberius very much detested his new wife, as she was unfaithful to him, and would exile himself to the islands of Rhodes after being given tribunicial power. Now that the sons of Agrippa were old enough, he once again gazed at them as heirs. His hope did not last as long as he wished, as Gaius and Lucius would die. The former would fall ill in 3 AD after being wounded in a siege, and returned to Italy, where he died a year later, while the latter died earlier in 2 AD in Marseilles. Augustus's plan of succession was in a big mess. The last of Agrippa's son, Agrippa Postumus, would be exiled to the islands of Planasia due to his violent nature. The only one left was Tiberius, who has now returned from his exile. Augustus would finally realize that his daughter was an adulterer and would charge her with adultery and treason, declaring the marriage void while exiling her to a tiny island in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Tiberius proved to his father that he was an astounding general, yet Augustus never liked his character, and that is why he was always at the bottom of the list of potential heirs. In 4 AD, Tiberius would be finally adopted by Augustus. However, he in turn had to adopt his nephew Germanicus. Augustus did not command many of his foreign wars and instead delegated much of the campaigns to his legates. He notably commanded his armies against the Dalmatians in his teens and against Cantabria after defeating Antony. Augustus would conquer and nearly double the size of the empire by consolidating Hispania, conquering Cantabria, Aquitania, Pannonia, Dalmatia, and the whole of Illyricum, besides Raetia and the Alpine tribes, known as Vindelici and Salaci. With his courage and clemency, he demanded the return of the eagle standards lost to the Parthian Empire by Marcus Crassus and Mark Antony. They not only returned them but also offered hostages into the bargain and announced that Augustus could choose which prince should be chosen to claim the Parthian throne. It was also under his reign where the gates of the temple of Janus Quirinus, which had been closed no more than twice since the foundation of Rome, were opened 3 times in a shorter period, as a sign the empire was at peace. The period would be known as Pax Romana, and was the prosperous time of Rome. However, not everything was fine and dandy, and the Romans would suffer significant losses while expanding into the barbaric terrains of Germania. Augustus believed the ideal borders of the north would be the two rivers, the Danube and Elbe. In 12 BC, his stepson Drusus would successfully campaign into Germania, expanding Roman control and influence. However, he would fall ill and die earlier in 9 BC due to him falling off his horse and dying from an infection a month earlier. Not the best way to go. Augustus's older stepson Tiberius would take command of the Rhine legion. In the same year, the catastrophic Battle of the Teutoburg Forest would take place. Publius Quintilius Varus, who would lead 3 legions to be decimated at the forest after being ambushed, would haunt the emperor for the rest of his life. He would become more reclusive and would grow out his beard. He would be heard screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The expansion to Germania would be abandoned forever, never reaching Augustus's ideal border. The event was so traumatic to the emperor that he became very miserable and withdrew from public spotlight. Augustus was seen by many as a charming and charismatic individual and was well loved by the people. He was very humble as he preferred to live the life of a commoner rather than of a king. He did not preside in the imperial palace, but instead lived in a modest but spacious house on the Palatine Hill. He would also cast a vote himself in his own tribe like an ordinary citizen, and expected his friends to be bound by the same laws as their fellow citizens and equally liable to public prosecution. Although he was a great man, he was not perfect. One of his controversial events was a private banquet hosted, known as the Feast of the 12 Gods. His visitors were dressed as gods and he himself represented Apollo. It caused a public scandal as a food shortage was happening which outraged many with them shouting, "The gods have gobbled all the grain." It was also ironic that he was strongly in favor of harsher marriage laws and held his wife Livia to live up to a virtuous woman. Yet he was an adulterer, having many affairs with his mistresses. He wrote several works of art composing Sicily, a short poem in hexameters, and an equally short collection of epigrams. Furthermore, he wrote work on the encouragement of the study of philosophy, linking to Stoicism, and 13 books of an autobiography going up to the Canterbury War. However, the memoirs were sadly lost. He had an ambition to be proficient in Greek, and studied under the tutorship of Apollodorus of Pergamum, and taught him elocution. Afterwards, Augustus spent time with the philosopher Arius and his sons Dionysius and Nicanor, who broadened his general educations, but he never learned to speak Greek fluently. In 14 AD, Augustus left Rome with Tiberius to venture to Capri and then Beneventum. While sailing to Capri, Augustus would fall gravely ill, which resulted him in resting and feasting in Capri for 4 days. When they crossed back to the mainland, Augustus could not venture further and died at Nola on 19th August 14 AD, 1 month short of his 76th birthday. His final private words are believed to be, "Have I played my part well?" and applaud as I exit. With his death, he laid the foundations for his successors, but should they choose the righteous path or lead Rome into misery?